I'm running it from down here. I don't know anything about technology at all, so wish me luck. I'm assuming the arrow down means go to the next one. This is the title, yay! Crossing Borders Performative Work in the Indigenous Art Space. And what I mean by crossing borders is everything that we've really talked about today, kind of everything being connected and nothing being decontextualised. And that's really, performative work can encompass a whole range of things. I'm talking about performance in some aspects of what I'm talking about today, but also objects within that performance, so it kind of crosses everything. Oh, how do you do it?
It should be just the little arrow.
Okay, good. So, Indigenous cultural art forms have never been previously decontextualised, as I said, in the ways Western art has been, and it's struggled with the insertion into these paradigms. And I don't think it's struggled from our perspective, but I think it's struggled from the Western perspective of actually trying to understand and make sense and critique some of these performative works and cultural art forms. Relatively recent developments in Indigenous contemporary theatre and art have challenged curators and consumers to shift cultural paradigms in order to engage with new works. And that, I think, has really been a shift that's only happened, well, particularly since sort of the 1940s and 50s, when work was sort of, there was a shift with visual art forms in becoming less ethnographic, or seen as less ethnographic. But then with this kind of huge surplus of new playwriting and new work that kind of happened in the 70s and 80s and then the 90s, there was this real shift in this cultural paradigm of actually telling Indigenous story on stage and in theatres and in the visual arts that made people sit up and take notice, but also made people really uncomfortable because they weren't quite sure how to actually engage with that work. And that is because there was no sense really of how to incorporate that voice and the history behind that voice and what was embedded within that. It's begun to be accepted that categories of Indigenous art forms previously considered from a Western perspective as being relatively hermetic or insular can be opened up to find common links between one another that encourage dialogue and a shared narrative. And I think for most Indigenous artists, the whole point is to speak to be seen. And that's really what we're talking about across all broad art forms, not just Indigenous art forms either, but across, Western art forms as well. Cross-cultural aesthetic adaptation and translation is not new, but finding a different and more receptive audience for performative Indigenous works encourages an audience to become more versed in multilingual aesthetics. And this was a thing I was looking at when I was kind of researching around this, was this idea about multilingual aesthetics. And it's kind of shifted a little bit from there as well, because when we hear lingual, we think voice, and we think we have to have a shared common sense of language around that. We actually don't. It doesn't necessarily mean you're speaking English and sharing that. Multilingual for me really means multi-paradigm, I guess, and so not based in this Western canon, but actually being able to understand Indigenous performative work in a myriad of ways that don't require language, and that's critical. Certainly in my background as a visual arts curator, one of the key ways in which we have a voice is to speak without English, speak without words. But that also is the case in theatrical and performative work as well. One thing that has started coming up a lot, particularly in the visual arts, but certainly in theatre as well, and kind of in the performative arts in the Indigenous areas, is there is not a great deal of language around critiquing that work. Certainly from ourselves, there are not many Indigenous critics, and certainly even less so from outside of that. So there is this recognised lack of an adequate language in Western art practice to discuss and critique Indigenous contemporary art practice in an informed and appropriate manner. And informed meaning that you've actually shifted your paradigm to actually trying to understand what's embedded within the work. And appropriate is trying to question it rather than trying to be critical of it because you don't understand it. It's only when audiences and critics become versed in multilingual aesthetics that we will develop frameworks to imagine and comprehend the histories, aesthetics, cultures and subjects of Indigenous art practice. So this all sounds really critical and negative, and I'm not going to apologise for that. I think that it's really a relatively recent phenomenon that we've started understanding Indigenous visual arts and performative arts in any sort of reasonable manner, and understanding it from our perspective, allowing that voice to actually be the dominant voice within that. Oh, please don't not work. Oh, there we go. All right, this is one of the critical sort of thinkings, I guess, around performative work, and that includes everything we've talked about today with objects as well, is this notion that Indigenous identity is mutable, adaptive and problematised. Resistance and tension in framing identity, in particular ways both by the coloniser and the colonised within a post-colonial paradigm, plays out in performative work. And what I want to make mention of at that point is that when we're talking about time, and we're talking about sort of dichotomies of time, like so many people have mentioned today, that there's the start of civilisation and then this amazing end where we're all fantastic and westernised and we're doing great things and it's industrialised and la la la. That's a linear sense of time within that space, and that you start off not real great and you really come good at the end. Within Indigenous performative work there's a lack of hierarchy in the notion of time. There's no agendas about that. So there's not this sense of being sort of bad and problematic at one end and then better by the end. And you'll find that when you're looking at storytelling. There's a really great book by Paddy Rowe called Gularabaloo, and it was one of the first books that came out that sort of addressed this idea about storytelling in an Indigenous paradigm. And there is no beginning, middle and end to this book. And it's really difficult for people who are so used to reading books like that to actually understand that, in fact, there are other modes of storytelling, there are other modes of understanding time and hierarchies of time. And there are other ways of understanding identity that don't require you to be the other as well. And so that's, I kind of want to, some of that sort of, this is a really complex topic, obviously, but some of that I'll show you in the videos, hopefully, if they work. Otherwise, I'll have to act them out, which will be awful. Even various modes of hybrid identity still exist within a dominant Western framework, and much performative work seeks to exist outside of this. So actually, lots of the performative work that we see and that we write and that we perform actually seeks to be something other than within its Western context. Oh, hang on. Within the dichotomy of us and them, or the other, resistant aesthetic practices such as those found in Indigenous performative work help to activate a reclamation and a repositioning of imposed identity. In other words, subverting identity from within the dominant structure. I'm all about that. What that does is that when you have the Indigenous voice that's centre and within the centre, and that paradigm is sitting, really clear within that, you decide what your identity is. You don't have it forced upon you or imposed upon you. And so often, it was really interesting, the last talk, and the other talks about sort of objects as well, and that trajectory of time, is that the Western society around Indigenous objects and around Indigenous people has sought to impose an identity. Obviously, we all know that. And that's been problematic for a whole range of reasons. But what we do with performative work is we flip that on its head. It can also challenge the ways in which a viewer can receive work and the ways in which time and reality work within the performative space. I'm going to show you a clip from the 2002 Perth International Arts Festival, and it's a work called Firefly Burning Bright. I don't know if anyone had a chance to see that work. I saw it. It was a really long work, and one of the criticisms that came from someone, I think, in the Sydney Morning Herald, was about the fact that, oh God, why did it take so long? Why did they have to, why did they have to make it be 2 hours for this? Basically, what was a funeral? A funeral at the end of it. Hadn't quite got that. In fact, the whole notion of making you sit within a quiet space and actually be present within a performance was critical to the performance. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about shifting paradigms, I guess. So, hopefully, these are the performances that I'm going to sort of chat a little bit about. And we haven't got a lot of time left now, of course, because of the technological issues. So I'm going to have to run through it fairly quickly. But these performances do demand a new kind of engagement, which is often part of the embedded intention behind making the work. And I was, I've been in visual arts for the last 20 odd years, and then I've shifted to theatre. And it's been a huge shift in some ways and not in others, because the sort of embedded intention behind every work, I think, whether it's, I saw the Yirra drawings in Darwin when they were shown as a contemporary exhibition, extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary work. And I think all of those things, the embedded intention is to demand a new kind of engagement. They're asking you to see us, to really see us and to see us differently. And actually are not saying or suggesting that you should have an opinion about that necessarily, but really standing and making a claim on space and saying this is who we are. So, Five Burning Bright is the first one. Mana Manam Dilabib Benawaranji, Guria Guria, Napaji Napaji, Bound and Unbound Sovereign Acts 2, and the Nyungar Sonnets. The first one, as I said, was performed at the Perth International Arts Festival in 2002 and also in Melbourne. Guria Guria has been around for a while and been performed for a while at various venues. Nyapaji Nyapaji was a show which Trevor Jamieson actually wrote and starred in about his family who were affected by what happened at Maralinga. But it's so much more than that. And Bound and Unbound was actually shown at Tanundi, which I was fortunate enough to be at as a moderator on a panel. And Ali was on my panel, who's part of Bound and Unbound, and that was an extraordinary thing to witness. And then the Nyungar Sonnets, which I'm part of, creatively producing at Yaakin at the moment. So there's lots of writing there. I'll just go through it. So the Neminawalan Performance Group was really started by Peggy Patrick, who's a senior law woman. And I want to just share with you really quickly. You saw in the presentation before, there was, who was it? Gunyabi, was it? Who was dancing and kind of speaking to the work. We had, from the MCA, I don't know if you remember the Paddy Bedford show that was at the MCA a number of years ago, and we had that come across to Perth, and I curated that exhibition in Perth for AGWA. And we had, because it was one of the last times we were going to be with that old man. He was very ill at the time. And all of the East Kimberley mob, including Peggy Patrick, who started Neminawalan, actually came down because they wanted to show respect to this man. And we had a number of the works, number of his works obviously up on display, and other works from the East Kimberley. And we roped off the area, and I put curtains up around the area, which was not normally done, but Peggy and the mob had said to me, we actually need to be taken back to country to be able to perform this junba for this man, for the opening. So, and this is naughty and you're not supposed to do it, but they actually were allowed into that space, and they were touching those works, because those works were a direct link to country and to their country. And they needed to be in touch with that space so that they could correctly activate what they needed to actually show that respect and to perform that junba. Junba is like a ceremonial dance. I guess that's the easiest way to explain it. Of course, it's much more than that. And when they did so, when they actually did the performance for him, it took as much time as it needed, and they directly referenced that work. I'm telling you about that because what we might see as purely, say, visual art on the wall or a performance that's a nice dance and we all clap at the end is actually so much more than that. It's embedded within our culture, and I'm not just talking about culture from the Kimberleys or from the Northern Territory. I think Wesley made a really good comment before about the fact that a lot of our objects have been destroyed. A lot of those objects were destroyed in that fire, particularly in Perth for the Nyungar, for the Nyungar people, the Nyungar mob. We're one of the biggest language groups in the country. We have 14 different dialects, and we take up all of the southwest of Western Australia. But so many of our objects have been taken or lost. And so there is a real sense from some people that we don't have language or culture, and because those objects are invisible. But we do, and we share that with a lot of the Gidja mob and a lot of the Wongo mob, and there's song lines. Someone mentioned that before, but we have song lines through those areas. I guess it's just, what I'm trying to say is it's important to not decontextualise these things, that all of our objects, all of what we do, all of our work is performative, and it actually doesn't matter where it exists. It doesn't matter if you understand it or not, because it will continue to be there. Back to Fire Burning Bright. There was 2 acts, and the first act was I guess a pantomime almost, of this story of the poisoning and murder of Aboriginal seasonal workers up in the Kimberleys. They had killed a bullock, and WA is frontier country, and it still is. And it was pretty savage back in the day, and it still is in some ways. So what happened was these mob killed a bullock for food, and in retribution they were poisoned. A whole big mob of them, including women and children, were poisoned and murdered. The second part of the narrative in which the criticism was aimed at was a junba, proper junba, about performative death rituals and rites, and sending these souls off to the right place. Now, hopefully, that's one of the excellent pictures are working. This is good. So these aren't great pictures, but they're deliberately supposed to be so. Actually, the photographer that took them understood that, in fact, this is a story about ghosts, if you want to call them that. This is a story about long dead ancestors. But this is part of the performance and part of the burning of the corpses. It's a really gritty story. It's the truth. This is what happened, particularly in the Kimberleys. And hopefully, fingers crossed, we can see a little bit of the video of it.
The Bedford Downs Massacre, the story of the Junba, the song and the dance cycle reworked for a Western audience as Fire Burning Bright. This happened at the time of the First World War, and the story is reenacted by the descendants of the men who were killed. For over 40,000 years, the Gidja people of the East Kimberley region of Australia had cleared the land with fire, allowing grasses to grow and attract kangaroos for food. The Gidja did not need fences. Some 200 years ago, white men took over the kangaroo grazing lands for their cattle, leaving the Gidja to starve. The Gidja were starving and killed a bullock for food. The station owner and foreman caught them and handed them over to the police, who chained them together for the long march to jail.
And just take note of
When they
what's
were
on
released,
their chests
the police gave
as
them
well.
signs or tickets to wear around their necks. The Gidja men thought these were good. They didn't know that the tickets gave any person the right to kill them. They returned to the station on their traditional lands to work for the station owner again, cutting timber for a fire, while the foreman put poison in their food.
The performance group, by the way, took absolute relish in playing the white station owners. They really did. And for me, I think that was part of that healing process of actually being on the other side and seeing what it was like to be on the other side and putting themselves in someone else's shoes.
They were clubbed, poisoned, shot and burned. If you go to the site of the burning today, you will find that nothing grows there. After the massacre, the spirits of the men who were killed went on a journey across the top of Australia. The second half of the dance and song cycle tells of that journey. My photographs telling the story and showing the positive and forgiving spirit of the Gidja was shown in Kununurra Library in July 2003. The exhibition, Spirit of the Gidja, was introduced by Peggy Patrick.
Turn that, yeah, cool. Thanks. That would have stopped automatically before. So that's a little snapshot of Firefly Burning Bright, but I wanted to point out the tickets. And this is that kind of crossover with work. They painted those tickets in ochre, and those tickets are a work of art in themselves. They were donated to the Art Gallery of WA. We have them in the collection, and they remember that time and that performance. And that performance hasn't just stopped with this, it keeps being performed and reenacted. Just not necessarily for Western eyes, but we have the object evidence of that, which is interesting in a state art collection. Now, whether you see that as visual art or whether you see that as memory and kind of a keeping place for memory, I see it probably more as that. Going on to Gaudy, I think I have to be quick now. It was... Oh, you can read it there anyway. It was devised by Dalia Pigram of Marageku. It's a real collaborative kind of work. Vernon Archie is someone in visual arts who you would know of him probably. He's done the Palm Island. You know, he's famous for his kind of work of the Palm Island, large portrait shots, and I'm referring to that here because that is the kind of work that's in this space, in Gaudy. And it's a warning call, basically, of this particular bird. And I don't have video of it, but I do have images of it. That's Dahlia there. And Dahlia, we just finished a show at Yirra called So Long Suckers, and Dahlia was actually our choreographer for that as well. So we had choreographers and dancers and visual objects and things like that sort of within that space as well. And this is kind of where the tide's kind of going, I think, now. Oh, maybe we do. Are we okay to play this one? My apologies for this because it would normally just play through normally.
Wali karangayo. Paano kabungan? Kular kabungan. The time the word suicide did not exist in African languages is over.
Cool. I'm just giving you snapshots of these. I could talk for an hour on each one about, you know, what's embedded within them, but it's really just a snapshot, so you kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about performative work, which embodies everything. You saw the text there, the text-based stuff. Language, of course, is massively resurgent in this country, Indigenous languages, and that is something that we are incorporating into every aspect of our performative work, and even in our visual arts work. Really critical, actually, again, for identity and for making a stand. Nyapaji, most people would probably be familiar with Nyapaji, but Trevor recounted his family story of displacement and dispossession due to the nuclear testing at Maralinga. The beauty of this work is that there was such a huge language component to it and a big community development component to it. And this is where our art forms connect more deeply, become more embedded within community and connect really deeply within community. By the end, this was done sort of 4 times in communities, and by the end, like the 4th showing of it, was only able to be understood by someone who could understand Perejinjara. And if you saw all 4 performances, you would have picked up enough to be able to understand the last performance. That was a really direct sort of intention of that work. Again, something that makes people really uncomfortable, you know, when you're watching something. I mean, it's different when it's SBS and it's got the subtitles on the bottom, but this was not that. And that was the purpose, is to actually get people out of their comfort zones and to actually make them feel what it's like on the other side, where, you know, we have our languages, but we speak in the dominant tongue, and what that does in terms of when you perform something, when you're performing something. So these are just, I don't have footage of this one, I don't think, but these are just shots from it. There's Trevor there. Bound and Unbound was this incredible work that was done by this collective, Colonia Baker, Faye Roses Blanche, Natalie Harkin and Simon Ulal-Couture. And I had first seen it actually at Tanundi and was completely moved by it. The women had made these beautiful bark skirts, and I'll show you. Oh, I should talk about the work first. The work speaks back to colonial institutions and power as dominant repositories of culture and knowledge. So you'll see that in the images. With the photographic work, they projected that work onto buildings. So they did a walk through, you know, the main sort of roads in South Australia, where the library was, and the state, you know, government buildings, and the art gallery, and they actually projected these images and these words onto the buildings, and then came to within a very sort of enclosed space and did that also. And that was really to speak about this sense that all of those institutions hold our words and our stories, and are very colonised and have colonised us. So it was kind of flipping that on its head and being subversive. So these are these beautiful paper bark skirts that they made, and even part of that making and part of what comes into these performances, as I've found working at Yirra Yaakin, is really the storytelling and the yarn telling and the coming together and making things before the work actually even then happens. And that part of the journey is really critical and really important. So you can see there's some of the text-based stuff again, and what you can't see in these ones is some of the, there's the image there. So that was worn on their heads, obviously, and this is large-scale projection. And they were placed onto people's bodies as well. So people were kind of embodying these ideas, whether they wanted to or not. Now, the Nyungar sonnets. This is what I'm ending on. It's a bit scattered, sorry, because I was a bit put out by the technological issues, but the original idea, and this is what we're working on at the moment, we're all familiar with Shakespearean sonnets. The original idea was to translate them into an Australian Indigenous language. It was Kyle Morrison who a part of our Accelerate alumni, and my boss, our artistic director, had this idea to actually translate them and then perform them at the Globe, which a group of a mob did, Kylie Farmer and Trevor Jamison and Kyle. And then we started sort of developing this idea into a community language development project with this idea of, well, it's kind of threefold, multifold. You revitalise language and culture, because language is critical to culture. So once you start revitalising language, everything else steps up with that. So it was about revitalising language, and we do have many fluent Noongar speakers over that way. Developing a group of performers who could perform in Noongar language, and actually then adapting it into a full-length play, which will be Macbeth. And we're hoping to have that at the Perth International Arts Festival in 2018. So these are just some of the images. So this is how we're working. This is Mum York is Auntie. So Mum York Roma there in the middle, she's our senior language consultant, and we have many of them in our hometown. And this is some of the crew that are learning the sonnets. These people were already familiar with language, but they've become fully versed in language as it relates to Shakespearean sonnets. Now, the critical thing to understand about this is that this is an adaptation. It's not a translation. It's a new form of prose. It's completely unlike anything you will have seen before. I'm really, really proud of it, actually. But what it's doing, and what this mob have told us about, is that it's making them proud. It's making them feel like they want to actually teach other people Noongar language. As we all know, language was something that was forbidden in so many of our institutions, particularly for our older mob. And they carry that great hurt within them about that, and they haven't shared a lot of that. And these younger mob are making it okay for people to start talking language again, which is a absolutely beautiful and empowering thing. So Kyle's there on the end, on far right, looking real happy about it. But these people are dedicated to not only becoming highly fluent in our language, but also sharing that love around and actually teaching others. So this is one of the sort of studio things that we did. This is in our rehearsal space up at Subiaco Arts Centre, and these are just people who have said they want to come along to these workshops, and we make them speak in language for most of the time that they're in there, it gets them completely out of their comfort zone. But you'd be surprised how many Noongar words they actually do know, because most of our suburbs in Perth are named after Noongar words: Girraween, Valga, Malaga. It's actually Malaga. There's a whole range of words that are used frequently, and people don't even know that they're actually speaking Noongar. So people actually did know a fair bit, but part of the reason we're actually teaching them this is because what we want to do at Yaakin, in terms of performative works, is actually have more works in language, and not just Noongar works, but other works. So we're talking to people from the goldfields as well. Language and theatrical art form go perfectly together in a way to be able to kind of subvert the art form, I think. I'm going to show you a little clip. This is the last thing. I'm going to show you the little clip that we've got. It's just a promo clip, but it does have some language in it. So.
Leja bal kwabra wajirang wilgi kwabra kwab board mirnich winyan mirnich mort wilgi mirlinwa jalenwa morn mirnich murdich kaya. I'm Kyle Morris. I'm the artistic director of Yirra Theatre Company and also a sonneteer. We first developed these sonnets to be a part of the London's Cultural Olympiad. Now we are working to build a team of Noongar sonneteers to help teach Noongar culture through the dynamic form of language.
Vera kella ngan karichnona nonan kwa vichwa jura kella.
Wara ma marang baming bon jilba.
That first one, by the way, was Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?
To be learning my language. It makes me feel like a whole person.
We can use art, something that we all love, as a special vehicle for us to be able to reawaken a lot of the vocabulary that has been dormant for a while.
It's afforded many sort of insights and thoughts and opportunities and experiences that I just would not otherwise receive or be a part of.
It's been an awesome journey, and now looking towards the future to hear it out of our young people's mouths as we build up towards a full stage production.
Kaya, Ngala Durapin, Nija, Shakespeare, Nyunga Wangin.
Nyunga Wangin, Nyunga Talk. I guess I want to say about that, when we perform, and I use that in inverted commas, when we perform language, when we perform our culture, what happens is, and we're talking about objects too. I talked about the Jonba before and the mob touching the work. When you enact that as an Aboriginal person, it comes up through your feet and you connect back to your country. This is why I have to speak in Nyunga when I first come here, because this is not my country, but I connect back to my country when I place myself within that. And so performative work for us is very much about flesh and blood, about, you know, the reality of living as an Aboriginal person. It's about reconnecting to where you stand, standing in your own truth. We talked a little bit before about sort of this great forgetting that's happened, but actually I don't think Indigenous people have ever forgotten. I think we've always remembered. I think we continue to remember and perform our culture every single day. Thank you for listening.
So obviously I'd just like to thank everyone today and reaffirm the idea that we started with, that these this is really a launching point for ideas for all of us to continue, for all of us to build on, and for all of us to kind of start a new story of our own. So get the word out there, keep those fires burning, get the story of the Garden Palace on our agenda, and thank you so much for coming.
I'll be very brief. Just a few thank yous. Thank you to the Art Gallery for hosting this event. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to our education and public program staff headed by Sue Saxon. Well done. Great congratulations to Jonathan. You're not only a very, very, very talented young artist, but also you're very good at putting symposiums together. Well done. And please, the last of the third symposia is on the 6th of August at the museum. Please make sure you come and tell your friends about it. Have a good evening. Bye.